Hi, I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast, the show where you can learn from people who may be unlike you. We're now into our 10th series. I can't believe that we have published over 70 episodes so far, ranging from an explorer and an entrepreneur to a climate-conscious activist and a composer. As always, our guests have come from around the world. I think more than 25 countries at the last count. And more than half of them are also first-time podcast guests. We are very proud of the fact that we can bring their stories to you in this way and help them to reach a new audience. Well, for those of you who are first-time listeners to the podcast, you may not know that you can find a transcription for each episode on our website, accesstoinspiration.org. So hop on over there if you find that reading their stories whilst listening will be easier for you. Well, one of our listeners recently asked me why we started this podcast, so I thought I'd explain that. Because I guess as human beings, we are inherently social creatures, and to survive, I know that we need to work with others. However, we tend to underestimate the extent to which we can learn from people who are different to us, because many of us often feel safer to work with our familiar social groups. Well, I've travelled to over 70 countries in my life so far, and I realise that there's a danger that if we don't gain broader perspectives from people who may be from different countries or who are different to us, we can become prisoners in our own paradigms. And there are lots of examples of the consequences in the world when that has happened, when groups or teams have taken that approach. It was our aim with this podcast, Access to Inspiration, to help you, our listener, to broaden your perspectives and to encourage you to listen to and learn from those who are different to you. Maybe they live in a different country, do a different job, or are a different gender to you. And we hope that by bringing that diversity, it will give you some inspiration and some new insights. Also, maybe ask yourself, well, what should I listen for when I'm listening to these podcasts? Well, 3 ideas came up in my mind when I was thinking about this question. First of all, perhaps consider being curious and listen as if you were the host. What question would you want to ask this guest? Number 2, try and listen for what's not being said by the guest or the host. And what does that cause you to think about? And finally, number 3, maybe step into the shoes of the guests themselves. Imagine yourself in their world and facing their challenges, living their lives. What insight might you get from imagining that situation? And I think if you take one of these 3 approaches, then I'm sure you will learn something new and it will give you some inspiration. We have a fantastic lineup of guests coming up in this forthcoming series. I'm going to be speaking to voice coach Susan Murphy about how to communicate using your authentic voice. And then Adeyanju Olomola from Nigeria. She's going to be talking about how to overcome imposter syndrome. Then heading to Finland to speak to Thomas Luther, who's the CEO of an infrastructure growth company. And then I'm also excited to be interviewing Elena Rossini, an Italian film director and activist. And then another amazing woman, Jane Atkinson, an engineer who was the first woman in the world to manage a blast furnace. And to kick off Series 10 next week, we have a fantastic guest in Dr. Paul J. Zak. Paul is a professor of economics, psychology and management at Claremont Graduate University and is ranked in the top 0.3% of most cited scientists with over 170 published papers. Paul's 2 decades of research have led him to focus on the neuroscience of extraordinary experiences, and he will be explaining some of the neuroscience behind why we do need to connect with others. And I think you'll enjoy what he has to say. Here's a preview of what Paul had to say about immersion. That's the neurologic state where people have peak experiences. And as we recorded the podcast episode that you'll hear next week, Paul was also recording his neurologic state. And he showed me the printout afterwards, which was really fascinating. I felt like it was getting a report card on my performance as a podcast host.
Immersion has 2 key components. The first is attention. If you're not attending to what's going on, it can't be a great experience if I'm doing something else. The second is most of the variation in immersion over second by second has to do with what I call emotional resonance. how much your brain says, oh, this is so valuable to me. This is really important. And that emotional resonance is something that can be structured and created so that the experience for the person having it is as good as possible. There's more to it, but why don't we have this technology? And this is that, first of all, we had to find what these signals were in the brain. And then second, we had to develop a technology in which anybody could measure them. So I believe that our platform, Neuroscience, is the first neuroscience as a service platform that gives people this superpower, if you will, which is actually measuring people's brains in real time, which is so much fun.
Well, I hope that has whetted your appetite for Paul's episode coming up next week. Between now and then, remember you can keep connected with us on socials. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Or hop on over to our website, accesstoinspiration.org, and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do this at the bottom of the homepage. Look forward to connecting with you next week as we kick off Series 10. Bye for now.